So what we're going to do today here in Kabbalah Coffee is explore at the top. We're going to talk about rivers and wells, but more importantly, the notion of analogies, because this becomes a very, very important Kabbalistic topic. And let me explain what I mean. So often when studying Kabbalistic texts, often what happens is that you'll find a concept in Kabbalah being explained with a parable or an analogy, something from the natural universe. In other words, it'll say, so as an example, to understand the two divine names, Havaya and Elokim, let's look at the example of the sun and the clouds, for example, or the sun and the protective shield that is placed around the sun by God to ensure that the world doesn't overheat, so to speak. But you'll have an analogy brought in the works of Kabbalah. So I want to analyze right here at the top, what is the role of an analogy? What is the role of what we call in Hebrew a mashal? Let me spell that for you. In Hebrew, it's mem shin lamed, mashal. In English, you would spell it probably M-O-S-H, mashal, U-L or O-L, one of those two ways, mashal. And what is a mashal? A mashal is a way that you can use something in people's experience to explain a concept that might otherwise be abstract. So if I'm talking about the divine name of expansion or giving versus the divine name of contracting or concealing, I'll use the example of the sun, which radiates, and the shield around the sun, which would require another conversation to explain what that shield is, but the shield around the sun, which diminishes and holds back that light. Or in an example that I would probably use in a class, if I were to give an example, a mashal, an analogy, I would probably use the example of sunglasses, right? So you walk outside, it's a sunny day, and maybe it's too bright. Maybe you're skiing, and now you have the sun not only bright, but it's reflecting off the white snow. And so you need to wear sunglasses. So what do the sunglasses do? They, by definition, they cut or they darken the light so that it is containable to the recipient. And I've used the example of sunglasses before in the context of tzimtzum, which is contraction or concealment, to the point that whatever it is that's being given or transmitted can be received by the other. Sometimes you need to cut it in order for it to be received. That's a mashal. There's two ways to understand the role of a mashal. The most simple way is that it serves as an example to understand the concept, right? You're trying to explain an abstract concept, two divine names, Havaya and Elokim. So what language are you going to use, right? If you stick with the original language, so it remains, out there. If you use regular language, then who says you're using the right regular language? So what you need to do is you need to find an example that works. So a mashal, on the most basic level, an analogy is a tool that we have and that we use to take theoretical, abstract, higher, ethereal, mystical, spiritual, Kabbalistic concepts and make them understandable to us everyday human beings. That's one understanding. But let me give you a much deeper way of understanding the role of an analogy of a mashal. And that is based on the following idea. Everything that exists on our physical plane of reality originates above, so to speak, not physically above, but on a more spiritual dimension. So again, I'll say that one more time. Everything that exists below in our physical reality exists above in a spiritual form. Because this is the most basic law of spiritual gravity that states that if something is found down here, you know it came from up there. And the way energy flows through the universe is that it first begins as abstract energy or spiritual energy, and then through the process of hishtalshalut, which means the evolution of the chain of the world's energy, because through tzimtzum, the aforementioned tzimtzum, contraction, spiritual energy becomes more coarsened and more coarsened and more coarsened until the point that it transforms, if you will, and takes on the form of physical reality. And that becomes the physical reality that you and I know. So again, what that means is that everything that exists here, in fact, originates up there. And when I say up there, I mean in the spiritual realms. And that the way spiritual energy flows is that it starts in a spiritual way and ends up becoming materialized into the stuff that you and I know, which means that when you and I see something like a river, when you and I see something like a well or a wellspring, these are not random physical properties. When you and I see a mountain, it's not just a wonder of nature. What it is the end result of a given spiritual energy. Does that make sense what I just said? The stuff that you and I see down here is the product, the end product of something that begins as spiritual energy above. Yes, makes sense? Yes, sort of. I'm not getting a strong reaction, but I'm going to go with the assumption that I'm getting a strong reaction. All right? So, if it exists down here, it existed above. Everything has a spiritual source. So, for example, it says in Kabbalah that sweet foods, sweet items. Oh, I'm freezing. Is my connection freezing?
Yes, you're freezing a lot. You're on mine. You're coming in and out.
You've been on me. I don't know.
Okay, Sandy, maybe it's on your end. I don't know. But what I can do the robot.
Yeah.
And then.
No, I miss. Okay. You keep missing every other sentence. I'm going to go out and come back in if you don't mind. No problem. No problem. I'll let you back in. Okay. So what this means is a broadband symptom. Exactly. Right. By the way, it's funny because I once back in the day when I had Comcast, so they once came over to my house and we were having trouble with the connection. And the guy comes by and he says, he checks the lines and everything. He says, you know what the problem is? He says, the connection is too strong. I don't know. That's what he said. He said, we have to put I forgot the language it used. We have to put something on the line to actually narrow down because it's coming in too big for your equipment to handle. Anyway, talk about the need of a tzimtzum. That was capacitor, maybe it might have been a capacitor, but something that he was able to apply on the line, outside the house to cut it on its way in. Anyway, again, it's the need for a tzimtzum. That's a good example. So it says in Kabbalah that sweet foods, for example, right? Some foods are naturally sweet, some are naturally tart. Sweet food is deriving from the energy of chesed. Chesed is love and kindness and giving, generosity. It's sweet, right? It's very sweet. It's sweet in concept, right? The nature of someone who is a Baal Chesed, someone who gives a lot, we say that they're very generous. That's very sweet. Somebody gives you something, that's sweet of you, right? Why do we say sweet? It's interesting. Think about the concept. Why do we, even in English, right? Why do we use the expression, that's so sweet of you? Why sweet? Doesn't taste like anything, right? Somebody holds the door open for you at Starbucks. Yeah, social distance with a stick, whatever. Yeah, so you say to them, oh, that's so sweet. Why sweet? Nice, I get, but why sweet? So even in our own understanding, we connect, right? We draw connections between things that are not tangible, like motivation. Like we know the person held the door, but why did they hold the door? So we're attributing motivation or some sort of emotional disposition. We connect motivation or emotional disposition with taste. Very bizarre, right? We call it sweet. Well, sweet is a taste. Why is this sweet? Because even we know that there's a connection between concepts and things.
Kabbalah would say that where does sweet food derive? Because again, everything that's physical, everything that's manifest here is coming from a spiritual source. So where does the sweet apple come from, for example? Right? It comes from chesed. It comes from chesed. Chesed, loving kindness, divine loving kindness. And the things that are not so sweet, the things that are the opposite of sweet, is coming from divine gevura. So what's happening when you understand that? So then what happens when you study a Kabbalistic text that gives you an analogy using a physical property? It doesn't just mean that this is going to help us understand a concept that otherwise might be abstract. What it's also saying is that this very item is actually deriving from that spiritual concept. Are you with me? This very item that's being used to analogize the concept, the spiritual concept, is actually deriving from that very spiritual concept itself. Which means that in the process of giving an analogy, Kabbalah is expanding our understanding and really the framework of our understanding of the framework of the universe. That this thing, this item, today we're going to talk about rivers and wells. A river is not just a river. A river is an emanation or the end result of the power of Bina. Now it's something else. It's not just an example used to understand Bina. It's like Bina is Bina. It's one of the divine attributes, one of the powers of our soul. Bina is not just Bina, but to understand it, we're going to use a river example. A river which amazingly shares so many of the properties of the concept of Bina, the river itself is deriving from Bina. So by giving the analogy, we're not just explaining it, we're also expanding Bina and explaining Bina's effect on this natural universe. Does that make sense? We're, in essence, let me use other language, reverse engineering nature itself. We are reverse engineering the river and saying, if you look at the river, reverse engineer and understand it from a spiritual place, this is the stuff. This is the substance, the stuff, the energy of the river. Okay, so now I hope that made sense. Yes? Any thumbs up that it made sense? Yes? Okay, good. Now, today we're going to speak about rivers and well springs. There are many different ways that a river can form. A river can form from rainwater. A river can form from a snow-capped mountain, basically from precipitation, from moisture that comes from above. That can start a river. But a river can also start from a wellspring, from waters that break through the earth and begin as maybe a dribble of water, a few drops, turn into ultimately producing a broad river. So Kabbalah says, look at the wellspring and look at the river. Again, we're giving the example of a wellspring that is small by comparison. When I say small, I mean it's just a small trickle of water, versus the river that's a very broad and wide amount of water or flow of water. And this correlates nicely with the distinction between the two energies of Chachma, the well, and Bina, the river. So let's explain. Chachma, we've been explaining the last few weeks, is creativity, is human creativity. It exists, by the way, all of these energies exist both insofar as God is concerned. In other words, they exist on a larger cosmic sense. There's divine Chachma, divine Bina. But as the human being is created in the divine image, our souls mirror the same 10 powers that God invests in the universe to create it. So the same 10 powers, known as the 10 Sefirot, the same 10 powers that God uses to produce all that we have here, 10 spiritual energies, also exist within our soul as soul powers. Eser kochot hanefesh, the 10 powers of the soul. It's easier to speak about them in human terms and then understand them in a more abstract way once we understand it in human terms. And again, it's not just an analogy, it's literally deriving from those 10 energies the way they are above. So, what is Chachma? We've been explaining the last several weeks. Chachma is creativity, human creativity. We said it's like the Yud, right? The creative edge, the top point comes out of nowhere. It emerges from nothingness. You didn't have the answer. There was no idea. You had just a question that needed a solution. Suddenly, out of nowhere, emerges an idea. That's like the origins of the Yud, the top little point of the Yud, and then it develops into a core point. Not yet into an understandable idea, but into a vision of what is or what could be. Then it develops and expands into the understanding of Bina that breaks it down and seeks to understand a concept in all of its particulars. So in general, Chachma is the creative flash of insight that ranges from, wait, I don't have anything yet, but I think I'm about to get something, to I got something, but I can't explain it, to, all right, I have this seminal idea that could go any different direction, now let's break it down. So Chachma has a bit of a range to it, but in general, it's all creative. That creative flash, insight, vision, spark, the light bulb going off, or going on, right? So that's Chachma. Bina is analytical, breaking it down. When you take a concept, a point, and you're able to expand it, apply it, show parallels. This idea, it's kind of like that idea. So you widen, and then you go deeper in the idea, right? You break it down, you apply it, but you go deeper also. And the more you understand it, the deeper you understand it. So in all three dimensions, it's now broader, wider, longer, etc. This is brought to life in physical terms, in a physical way, by the wellspring, source, and the river, wider, broader, deeper flow. The wellspring might trickle a few drops. It's the origination. It's the water bursting through the surface, right? Yet you were looking at the ground and there was nothing. There was no water. And then you dug or whatever, suddenly out burst this water. You had to make a crack in the surface, right? For the water to come up. The water's there. It's like the ideas are out there in the universe, but they're not in our heads until there's an opening. Bittul, until there's, we recognize the limitations of our understanding. And then there's an opening, there's a crack. And the idea can come rushing in. But it doesn't actually come rushing in. It comes a drop. Just one drop, you have a seminal point. From that drop, now you and I go ahead and expand the idea. We apply the idea. We have adapt the idea. And that's like the river that emerges from the well. From those few drops of water that are breaking through the crust of the earth, from those few drops of water, you have now a broad, wide, deep river. All three dimensions. Or broad, long, and deep. That is the analogy that is used to explain or to depict in a visual the idea of Chachma and Bina. So Chachma, if you were painting or depicting Chachma, you might depict it as the wellspring. And if you're depicting Bina, it's Rechovot Hanar, it's the broad river. It says that the first two Chabad Rebbes were this Chachma and Bina. The Alter Rebbe, the founder of Chabad, so he taught in more short, terse terms. He gave short ideas, dropped short, when I say short, concentrated, powerful ideas, but using very few words in very short terminology, very cryptic. His son, the second Chabad Rebbe, took those ideas, those teachings, and expanded them at great length. So something that might have been mentioned in one or two lines could be elaborated on pages and pages and pages. So the Alter Rebbe was Chachma, His son was Bina, or the well and the river. Another example. If you've ever studied Mishnah and Talmud, so you know that the Mishnah states Jewish law in very abbreviated, short terms. The Talmud analyzes and questions and applies and questions again. The Talmud can go 20 pages explaining one teaching of the Mishnah, right? Why is that so? Because you have the seminal teaching, and then you have its development. And the development is obviously more than... Give you another example, a biological example. In the experience of procreation, you have what we call the contribution of Abba, father, and the contribution of Ima, mother, right? The contribution of father happens, right? Let's call it in a seminal moment, right? And the contribution of the mother is 9 months of development. So you have, again, the notion of the wellspring, the relatively few drops, so to speak, and then the development, the expansion, right? That's Bina. So that's why Kabbalah calls Chachma and Bina Abba ve'ima, father and mother. Because again, that's another way of understanding it in the context of procreation, another way of understanding the interplay between that which begins in very, abbreviated, concentrated terms, and then which further develops ultimately into something that has dimensions, and one is quick, one takes time, one is a single point, one is developed. Chachma Bina. Today we're going to focus on the exam. I'm giving you different ways of, different analogies, different mashalim. Mashal is singular, mashalim plural, parables, analogies. So I'm giving you different ways to understand it, concepts that we've explained at length over the last few weeks. But today we're going to focus on the well and the river. Because today we're going to actually introduce something that is quite incredible. The notion that although two things exist in close proximity and one thing follows the other, that doesn't necessarily mean that the two are coming from ultimately the same origins. And you'll see what I mean in a moment. This is going to be a very powerful concept. Okay, so I want to pause here for a moment and tell you what I attempted to explain in the first 25 minutes of this class. The objective here was to explain how Kabbalah is taught by taking concepts and giving physical examples, but also reverse engineering it and going the other way. It's not just using a random example for a concept, it's explaining how this example is actually deriving from the energy of the concept, and that's what produces it the way that it is, which means that a well is coming from Chachma. It's not just an analogy that we can use to explain Chachma. The well itself is coming from the energy of Chachma, and the river from Bina. So let me check in. Make sense? Any questions on this so far? No? Everything makes sense?
Yeah.
Okay? Perfect. Okay, good. Now, let's continue. Today, we're going to break a connection that seems obvious. There's a connection between Chachma and Bina, between well and river, that seems obvious. Today, we're going to break it. Oftentimes we think that we have cause and effect figured out. We know that if you do this, then this will occur. You push this button, the light will go on. Push it again, the light's going to go off. It's cause and effect, right? You pull this string, the thing comes down. You cut the string, the thing comes down, right? I'm thinking of the story, the parable that's told about there was once a man who hosted a party in his home. And in the middle of the party, suddenly, in the grand dining room, the chandelier comes crashing down. And it almost hits somebody. The owner is so perplexed. What's going on? He runs upstairs to the attic where the chandelier was tied. This is before
modern ways of connecting things. And he sees somebody over there had cut the rope. He sees somebody there, and the person, one of the guys said, I need to have a small piece of rope. What's the big deal? And so this is an example used to explain that no, even the things that we consider to be small, I just cut a piece of rope. The question is, do you know what the rope is connected to? So often in life, we think, what's the big deal? I'm going to make one decision, one choice, one action. It's not a big deal. But we don't know what's hanging on our choice. It's not just a small piece of rope that we're cutting. It could be a very big deal, even if we can't see it, like this fellow who didn't realize the consequences, that this rope was not just a small piece of rope, it was actually holding the chandelier. That's an example. So I said, sometimes you can pull something down or cut something and it comes down, just thinking of that analogy. Back to this story. So back to this point. Oftentimes we think that we have cause and effect figured out, that if we do this, that will ensue. And every time we do this, that happens. Then we think that obviously the two are connected. But sometimes, we get a little bit of insight to realize that it's not so simple. And even though this usually follows that, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily inherently connected. One might trigger the evolution of the other, but it's not guaranteed, and it's not that this evolves into the other, but it triggers its evolution from another place. So, for example, tell you a story, the story of Joseph. And again, the reason why I'm bringing this story is to give you an example of a break between what we would perceive as cause and effect normally. So Joseph is beloved by his father Jacob, and that raises the ire of his older brothers who don't appreciate the fact that Joseph, who is, a young whippersnapper, right? How this young fellow is getting the father's attention in a way that they feel that they're not getting. Whether that's true or not, doesn't really matter, but that's how they felt. So they did not like, at least the way the Torah tells the story, simply, they did not appreciate their brother, they didn't like his dreams, and so they sell him as a slave to Egypt, or they sell him as a slave, he ends up in Egypt. And there he's working for a fellow, he begins, he's bought by this fellow named Potiphar. Potiphar does stuff. He's involved in business. He has an operation going on, and he puts Joseph, the great Joseph, one of the sons of Jacob. He puts him, doing some menial labor. He's very successful, very talented, charismatic. So he climbs the ranks, and eventually Potiphar puts him in charge of all of his business. Until one day that Potiphar's wife seduces Joseph, is rebuffed by Joseph, and then accuses him falsely of assaulting her, whereupon Joseph, being the slave anyway, Joseph is convicted immediately of that accusation, of that crime, which he did not commit, and he's thrown into ancient Egyptian prison, a dungeon, which you can imagine was probably not a great place to be. And in that dungeon, the Torah tells us that there were two other prisoners. At some point, there were two other prisoners, the royal butler and the royal baker. Apparently, the royal candlestick maker did not get in trouble. It was just the butler and the baker. What had happened? The butler served Pharaoh a cup of wine, and the wine had a fly, and that was grounds to the dungeon. You're the butler. You don't serve the king with a fly in your wine, in his wine. So he was shipped off. And the baker had baked a loaf of bread for Pharaoh with a stone inside. And Pharaoh almost broke his teeth on the stone, and that was not cool. So the baker, off to the dungeon. You with me so far in the story? Yes? Okay. So one day, Joseph, the Torah says, one day Joseph sees that their faces were a little bit more gloomy. They looked sad. And so Joseph goes over to the butler and the baker, and he says, Madua penechem roim hayom. Why do your faces look so sad today? Why the long face? Why so downcast? Now, the obvious answer is, we're in prison. We're in a dungeon. Are you kidding me? What should I be? Like skipping? Like dancing? What is this, a musical? Of course we're going to, but Joseph, the ever sensitive, which is a beautiful lesson, no matter what happened to him in life, he always remained open and sensitive to others. So Joseph, the ever sensitive one, notices that this morning, this day, they were even more downcast than what was to be normally expected. So he says, Madua penechem rom hayom. Why are your faces so sad, downcast, solemn looking today?
They said, well, to be honest, we had some dreams last night that were very disturbing. And each one, the butler and the baker, they share their dream. And Joseph famously predicts, based on the dream, he says, these are not dreams, these are prophecies. Butler, in 3 days, Joseph will have his birthday party, and he'll need a butler. So he'll remember you. He'll remember that he threw you into prison, into the dungeon, and he will rescue you. He'll bring you out, and he'll reappoint you as the royal butler. The baker's excited. He says, and to you, the baker, based on his dream, which included him holding baskets of bread on his head and having vultures come down and eat the bread. Okay, that's an ominous sign. So Joseph said, the meaning of your dream, Mr. Baker, is that in 3 days, Pharaoh's going to have the same birthday party and the same need for a baker, and he'll remember you and then say, you know what, let me just end this guy, and he will execute you. He will take off your head. And the baker said, whoops, I guess I shouldn't have asked, because now I only have 3 days. Now I know that. But the butler, indeed, that's exactly what happened. In 3 days, the butler was reappointed to the position, and the baker was executed. By the way, if you want to know the rationale for it, the commentators explain, because the fly could have flown in after the butler had done his job. But the baker, are you with me on this, for the culpability? The fly could have flown in after the butler had already done his thing, the last minute, last second before it was served. But the baker baked the stone in. Come on, there's no excuse. All right. By the way, that's not me saying it. That's Pharaoh saying it, and the commentators explaining Pharaoh's justification. Okay, I would be more understanding for the baker. Maybe a lawsuit, but not like, it's not a capital thing. Okay, kidding about that, but not about the capital part. Getting back to the story. So the end of, it's a Torah, one of the Torah portions in Genesis. Joseph turns to the butler and he says, Mr. Butler, you're going to be rescued in 3 days. Please give, and you're going to work for Pharaoh again. Okay, please put in a good word for me. I'm innocent. I didn't do it. Right? He says to him, he says, I'm innocent. Put in a good word for me. And the butler says, sure, no problem. And the Torah tells us, the Torah, as the narrator says, the butler did not remember Joseph. He forgot Joseph. It's only 2 years later, when Pharaoh has dreams that he can't interpret, that the butler says, oh my gosh, I just remembered. There was a guy in prison with me back in the day, Joseph, some Hebrew slave, who was able to interpret my dream. Maybe you should give him a try and give him a whirl. And we know the rest is history. He interprets Pharaoh's dreams, tells him that the dreams are about years of plenty and then years of famine. Save up in the years of plenty for the years of famine. And Pharaoh says, I love it. I want to put you in charge. And he becomes viceroy. And the rest is history. But something important happened in that story, and I mentioned it. Between Joseph's act of interpreting the butler's dream and his request to the butler, please remember me and put in a good word to Pharaoh, intervening in that, from that moment, there's a 2-year gap during which the butler forgets. Pharaoh has to have a new set of dreams, or his own perplexing dreams, and then the butler remembers. And the commentaries discuss this. Why did it take 2 years? It seems like Joseph had done everything right. So you could answer sometimes, things take time. But the commentators explain that there's another very important lesson. And that is sometimes we think that we're in control. That if we make the right connections, push the right buttons, let me do one button here, push the right buttons, then automatically a result will happen. If I go to this school, get this degree, do this work, make these calls, make these connections, then automatically this is going to happen. And sometimes there's a gap between effort and consequence, enough of a gap, not because God wants to make it difficult for us, but because God wants to remind us that that's not how it works. Yes, we put in the effort, but all the blessing comes from above. All the blessing comes from God. The moment we think that our work creates the wealth is the moment that we fall into the mistake of thinking that we are in control, which is akin to idolatry. Because what is idolatry? It's believing that there's another force in control of the universe other than God. Well, guess what? I don't only have to have a little idol to bow down to. to be practicing idolatry. I can also believe that I am in control and that I created my own blessings through my intelligence and my hard work. And that's also a subtle, yes, but a subtle form of idolatry. The same idea of idolatry, that one is attributing power to another force in the universe, is the same notion behind the self-made individual. It's that God was not involved, I pushed the button, and out came the results. Therefore, God wants to remind us from time to time, not always, from time to time, that pushing the button is not what makes the result. We have to push the button because God says push the button. But the result happens as a blessing from God. There's a verse in Torah that says, the Lord your God will bless you in all that you do. And this and other verses, for example, regarding Shabbat, it says, 6 days a week you shall work, and on the seventh day you shall rest, which means the mitzvah is not just to rest on the seventh day. It should have just said every 7 days rest. No, it says 6 days you shall work, and the seventh day rest, which means the work is also a commandment. The first half of the verse is also a mitzvah. 6 days a week work, that's a commandment. Seventh day rest, that's also a commandment. But what's the first half of the commandment? Why do we need to be commanded to work? Because God says, I want to bless you. I want to give you. I want to give you money. I want to give you resources. I want to give you. But I don't make me do a miracle. Give it an alibi. Give it an excuse. Give it a cover story. So go to work, right? Make the calls, make the deals, right? Do all the effort. And then in that space, I will be able to gift you with what I want to gift you from above. The blessing is coming from God. The cover story is what we provide. But there's a gap sometimes between our effort and the results, enough to remind us from time to time that it's not a direct consequence of our actions that the results happen, but our actions are required because God says act. The results, though, are really coming from God. Does that point make sense? Yes? Lest Joseph think, biblical Joseph, that he was saved because of his own ingenuity, because of his own dream interpretation abilities, and his, advocacy, his advocating, or his asking the butler to advocate for him, his lobbying, right? Lest Joseph think that it's his plan that got him out of prison. God says it's going to take another 2 years, and I'm going to orchestrate more dreams and more things to happen, just so you know that this is coming from me. Or maybe not a message for Joseph, maybe a message for us through Joseph, that this is how the world works, which means that sometimes things can seem so simple. It's cause and effect, obviously, right? I push this button and this thing happened. Obviously, this caused that. Sometimes it seems obvious, yet there's a gap. Today, we're going to learn such a gap in the context of Chachma and Bina. Chachma, which is the seminal flash of wisdom. Bina, which is the expansion of that idea. We think that one leads directly to the other. We think that the wellspring leads directly to the river, and the river is coming from the wellspring. And although that lines up sequentially, as we'll see today, maybe when it's about rivers, that's true. But when it comes to Kabbalah, Chachma and Bina, it's a little bit different. Each one, as we'll see today, has its own direct source from above. Okay, I'm about to share my screen with you. But before I do that, I want to check in. Any questions or comments on what we've described thus far? Questions or comments? Feel free to ask.
I just have a question and comment. I'm not really sure how to phrase it.
Go ahead. Jump in.
The idea that I think it is powerful for me sometimes, the idea that I cause a thing, but I feel like it's hard to balance that, knowing that my hard work did partially lead to an outcome, but also it was God as well, and how to I think that's what you're talking about, how to split the difference, but I'm trying to wrestle with that.
Okay, so look at it this way, that your actions were absolutely an integral part in producing that, let's call it blessing. Absolutely necessary. But in what way? Not that it produced it, but that it's in the language of Kabbalah, it's making the vessel to receive God's blessing. So the blessing is still divine. But you and I have the obligation to make the vessel within which the blessing can be collected. Without the vessel, then the blessing is going to remain, in an ethereal space. So it absolutely is an integral part of the blessing process, but it's not generating the blessing in the way that we typically think. It's not creating the blessing, it's creating the vessel for the blessing. So it is important, yes. Could it have happened without that action of you? No. In the context of, you need that vessel to contain the blessing, or else the blessing remains somewhere else. If you want to think about it maybe a different way, using a different analogy, it's like a vacuum. You create a vacuum, and that is able to draw out, let's say, taking blood or something. So creating the vacuum is what actually draws out the blood. It's not going to come out unless you create that vacuum, unless you create that pull. So creating the vessel is what creates the pull, and then the blessing, well, I don't know, maybe that's not a good example. And the blessing, okay, whatever. The blessing is coming from God. Our actions are creating the vessel. There's blessing and there's vessel. So we get confused and we think that we're doing everything. Vessels and blessings, we're creating everything. That, number one, is not true. Number two, it puts tremendous pressure on us, because that means we have to run the world. We have to run ourselves and make sure that person is going to, there's so much pressure. There's so much responsibility that puts on ourselves. It's not even true. It's not accurate. It's not legit. God is in control, and God gives the blessings, right? God will bless you. And all that you do. God is the blesser, and then it's in the vessel of all that we do, but it's still God's blessing. So how do we split the difference? That was your question. What role does each play? I hope my answer is somewhat clear. God gives the blessing, we create the vessel. Do we have an important role? Yes. Is it necessary? Yes. Does it create the blessing? It creates the context for the blessing to be received, but it doesn't create the actual blessing. Right? It's like a radio station, one of my favorite examples, right? It's like radio. Yeah, you buy a radio, you tune it to the right station, and now you're listening to the radio. Great. Did you make the station? No. Right? You're channeling, you're making a vessel to capture the radio waves, to capture the sound. You're listening to your favorite song, right? Did you make the song? Did you record the song? Are you playing the song? No. You're receiving the song, but you had to do something to receive it. So that just allows, your actions allow you to receive the signal, but you didn't create the signal. The same thing is true with wealth, with all of our blessings, actually. It's not only money, it's everything that we enjoy. Our actions make us receptible, or whatever makes us in a mode of receptivity to receive the blessing. It doesn't generate the blessing. Okay, but the point of all of that was to explain how you could have something that, or a process that seems to be, 1, 2, and that 1 actually led to 2. And in fact, although 1 comes before 2 sequentially, each one has its own source, and 2, although it follows 1, it doesn't come from 1. That's maybe the most accurate way that I can explain what I'm trying to say. You have 1 in a sequence. You have 1 and then 2. So 2 is following 1, comes after 1, but it doesn't derive from 1. Does that make sense? You could have a 2 that comes after 1 sequentially, but doesn't come from 1. 1 is not generating 2. 2 has its own reality that's generated from its own source after 1 has done its thing. Hopefully this will become more clear as we go along today. Okay, let's jump in now. I'm going to share my screen with you, and let's take a look. So we're starting chapter 20. Yes.
I just have a quick question. So
Yeah.
is that the same as co-occurrence does not imply causality?
Yes, that's exactly what it is. Yes. Yes. Stated in simple terms. I mean, not simple, but I mean like clear terms.
Yeah.
Right. Say it one more time.
Co-occurrence does not imply causality.
Co-occurrence, perfect. Co-occurrence does not imply causality. Just because there was 1 followed by 2 doesn't mean that 1 caused 2, or more precisely in the language of our discussion today, it doesn't mean that 1 evolved into 2. 2 had its own evolutionary process, that followed necessarily one, but it doesn't come from one. It follows one, but it doesn't come from one. Yes. The short answer is yes. Let's jump in. Okay, chapter 24. I'm going to make this larger. This is very important stuff. Okay, I made it nice and big so that I can see and that you can see as well. Chapter 24. Just making sure I can scroll up and down this page with these. Okay. A further explanation of this concept one second. In Hebrew, it works better. It's in English, it sounds a little bit of a strange way to start a chapter. Okay. What he's trying to say is, let's go deeper into Chachma and Bina, creativity, creative wisdom, and analytical thought. And to understand this, let's quote ideas that are elaborated on in other places in Kabbalah. That's what he means by a further explanation of this concept is presented elsewhere, which we're about to explain here as well. Okay, let's jump in. Chachma and Bina. Let's explain the terms one more time. I'm going to highlight it. Chachma is creative wisdom. Bina, analytical. Chachma and Bina have two distinct sources and are independent of each other. This is the big idea of this chapter. I'm not going back inside. This is me speaking outside for a second. Although Chachma precedes Bina, and although Bina follows Chachma, they are not, it's not like Chachma merges into Bina and becomes Bina, evolves into Bina. No, they each have distinct sources. They are, in fact, independent of each other. It's just that one follows the other, yes. There is a proximity, but one does not come from the other, nor do they share the same source. In other words, the point of this is they're very different, right? Chachma and Bina, very different. And that's going to be the point of this chapter. True, back inside. True, there is a connection and relationship between them. For example, the seminal point of Chachma, right, is ultimately comprehended through Bina. Likewise, the comprehension attained by Bina could not exist without the point of Chachma, right? You can't elaborate or expand. You can't analyze an idea if you don't have an idea, right? You need something to analyze, right? You have a room of analytics, right? You have data, raw information, right? And now you have a team you have a team of analysts that are going to crunch your data, right? You need to give them something. What are they going to crunch, right? So you have to have, in order to have Bina, the comprehension attained by Bina could not exist without the point of Chachma. You need the raw data to be crunched in Bina. And so one leads to the other, one derives from the other, it seems. Although this is true, we're still going to explain that they have a different source. They're independent. Don't worry, we're still getting back to that point. But he's now working with the flip side, which is no, it seems like they are related very strongly and correlated. Metaphorically speaking, and this is where I started today's class, a river cannot exist without a wellspring as its source, right? Bina, the river is Bina, the expansion. So you can't have the expansion without a source. You can't have a broad river if you don't have an origin of the water. How are you going to have a river if there's no water? If the water's not coming up from the ground or down the mountain or whatever, then where's your river coming from? So you can't have, it seems, Bina without Chachma. In like manner, and every wellspring eventually expands into a river. So if you have a wellspring that's bubbling, eventually it's gonna go into a river. Where else is it gonna go? So your river must have a wellspring, and your wellspring must lead to a river. So it seems like Chachma, let's continue inside. In like manner, each point of Chachma comes to be understood through Bina, right? The wellspring of Chachma, the seminal drops of ideas, come broadened through Bina and understood in Bina, and each understanding of a concept through Bina emanates from a point of Chachma. Again, I hope the Hebrew terms are clear and not throwing anybody off. The point is that we have two steps of intellectual development. We have the first creative development, and then you have the analytical development. So it seems like step one and step two. Step one is creative flow, right? Ideas, but creative, not defined, not limited yet, not broken down, just creative idea, a point and a kuda. That then is followed by an expansion and understanding. And it would seem, right? It seems very clear that, at least at first glance, that one is leading to the other. You have the seminal point expanded in Bina. So Chachma is understood in Bina, and Bina comes from Chachma. You're understanding that which you had an insight into initially with Chachma. But look what he says here. In other words, this paragraph, from here, true, to the end of this paragraph is what we thought coming into this chapter. But what we're about to find out is what he says in the first line. That no, they're distinct and independent, even though they follow one the other. And that's what he reiterates here in the next paragraph. Nevertheless, right over here, this relationship between Chachma and Bina exists only because they incorporate and join one another. Let me see that in the original. He says, yeah. In other words, I don't like that English. Basically, Chachma and Bina look like that. They look like they're one directly causing the other, one coming from the other, because they're working together. But just because they work together doesn't mean that they're dependent on each other, right? Doesn't mean that they come from the same place. So this relationship, this apparent causality only appears so because of how closely they work with one another. And in the translation here, it used the word they incorporate and join one another, but I just want to speak very simply and directly. Because they work so well with each other, you could be mistaken to think that one just evolves right into the other. What started as a well evolves into the river. In truth, however, they are not dependent on one another for their existence. And this is, once again, the big idea, for each has a separate source. Chachma can exist without Bina, and Bina, I'll add some words, can exist without Chachma. Each one can exist independent of the other. This is huge. This is huge because what it's doing is it's breaking the analogy. The analogy of the river and the wellspring was set up in such a way that it would lead us to think, again, this is all what we would have thought, but now here's what we actually think. But what we would have thought is that Chachma and Bina work like the wellspring and the river. Just like the wellspring automatically will evolve into a river, and the river has evolved from the wellspring. So the two are really the same thing. It's the same water, right? What starts as a few drops eventually builds up into a larger amount of water. That's not any different. It's the same stuff. And that's causality, right? That's one directly making the other. The river is formed from the wellspring. The wellspring forms the river. That's direct. Chachma and Bina are not like that. Although these examples, like I said at the opening of the class, these are metaphors, parables, analogies, mashalim. These are used to explain Chachma and Bina. Nonetheless, in today's discussion, although in other places in Kabbalah, it seems like it's a dead-on analogy. Today we learn that there's a massive distinction between analogy and analog, between the wellspring river paradigm and the Chachma Bina paradigm. Why? Because in the case of Chachma and Bina, which we haven't explained yet, we've just stated it twice. In the case of Chachma and Bina, they are not dependent on one another for their existence. Each one has a separate source. Chachma can exist without Bina and Bina without Chachma. Let's continue. He's going to defend this hypothesis to illustrate. And now he gives, again, a practical example from our life and experience. There are innovative thinkers who constantly give birth to original ideas. These are the creative people. Yet, they are not analytically minded, comprehending matters thoroughly and grasping them so that they are firmly established in the mind. This is what we might call, I don't want to reduce it to a meme or a cliche, but let's say something like the absent-minded professor, although that's not, I don't think that's what he's talking about, but let's use that as an example of somebody who's their head is so involved in philosophy, let's say, in the theories, that on a practical level, they're not grounded. Now that could be a lifestyle, right? Their head, their cup mentioned, their head people of the head, right? People of the mind, and not paying attention to the everyday stuff. That's not necessarily what he's saying, but I'm using that as another way of understanding this idea. You have people that are Balei Chachma. They are masters of Chachma. You look at them, wow, they got a lot of Chachma. They are very creative, very creative. But tell that person to go write the business plan and to go break down exactly how they're going to do what they want to do, they won't be able to do it. They won't be able to do it. They can come up with the idea, but they can't articulate how it's going to get done. Not everyone that has creative ideas can't articulate. What he's saying is it's possible to have one without the other, right? It's possible to have there are, not saying all are, there are innovative thinkers, original ideas but they're not analytically minded. They just don't have that chush. They don't have that talent. They don't have, on some level they have some measure. We all have all 10 powers. They have some measure of bina, but consistently, they're the ones who have the very creative, very bold ideas, but can't see it through to the end. Don't seem to have that bina ability to really break it down, really ground it. By contrast, sometimes, not always, sometimes, an individual possesses understanding, bina, i.e. comprehends a matter thoroughly in all its intricacies until it becomes firmly settled in his mind. Yet, so this person is great in comprehending thoroughly. This person gets stuff really deep and well, really breaks down a concept or a subject to really hold it, to really grasp it. Yet, he cannot initiate original propositions. It's not a creative mind. He merely understands existing ideas, which he has heard from others or read in books. So give him an idea, he can run with it. But he's not going to come up with the idea, right? He's not going to come up with the idea. You have to give him the idea, tell it to him, or he can read it or whatever, but he won't come up with it. So these two paragraphs, let me highlight them. From here down here, these two paragraphs that we just did are illustrations. They're not rules, but they're illustrations of Chachma, paragraph A, Chachma without Bina, creative minds that don't have a strong ability to break it down and make sense of it. Or conversely, individuals that have a lot of Bina, comprehension, understanding, but not a lot of Chachma, not a lot of original ideas. So these two paragraphs are illustrating how one can exist without the other, which means something very important. That Chachma doesn't always lead to a river, and Bina doesn't always come from the wellspring of Chachma, right? It doesn't always come naturally like a flow from well to river. You can have the well of Chachma always, putting out ideas, breaking through the crust of the earth, breaking through, the soil and producing new water, but that person is not, in that person, it's not going to develop into a river. It might, but it also might not, which tells us that one doesn't necessitate the other. One doesn't automatically cause the other. That's still a separate power that also has to be exercised. And Bina, you could have a lot of an analytical power and ability, but you might not have creative ideas, which means that your river is not coming from your own creativity, which means, sure, you have Chachma, but this Bina power that you have is independent of Chachma. Does that make sense what I'm saying? Yes?
Rabbi,
Yes.
I have a question. So it seems that there we're talking about that from the perspective of the 10 soul powers that we have. But on it, does that also on a spiritual level? Because it seems that when it says comprehends a matter thoroughly, the matter must come from somewhere.
Yeah.
So the matter where it's coming from would seem to be Chachma. So
right.
Yeah.
No, so excellent question. The point of this is that just as it exists within the human being, that there is the power of Chachma, creative thought. There is the power of Bina, analytical thought. And usually one follows the other, one comes from the other, or one generates the other, at least the way we look at it. But in truth, they each have their own they're each separate energies with their own reality. They exist in their own worlds. There's the world of creativity and the world of analytics or analysis, two different realities. Just like it exists within the human condition, that these are two distinct soul powers, the same thing is true above. They are distinct emanations of God. And although they come from the same place, right? They come from the same God ultimately. Everything comes from God. So when we say that Chachma and Bina have their own source, I mean everything comes from God. So it's all one. But not going so idealistic or so high up. It has its own energy. It has its own self-contained energy. The same thing as it exists in the soul would exist above in the divine emanations. Chachma is Chachma. Bina is Bina. It's not like Chachma becomes Bina or Bina is formed from Chachma. Chachma has its own independent energy and Bina also has its own independent energy. Doesn't mean that they can't work together and that they don't oftentimes work in almost sync with each other, but at the same time, they are independent. And the same thing, to answer your question in short, the same thing would be true about above. They're not the same energy. They're distinct energies.
So in a sense, your Bina may be coming from somebody else's Chachma.
Yeah, that's what he's saying. Well, but again, that's just the physical demonstration of the fact that they're not essentially and necessarily linked. Once we break the link, then we've proven our point. It doesn't have to be proven the same way above. The point is they're not necessarily linked. That's the point. And the illustration is, look, you have creative minds that don't have that. You have people that are wellsprings of ideas that never themselves widen it into the river. If they were so intimately connected, then everyone who had Chachma would have Bina, and it's not true. And everyone who had the power of Bina would also have creative ideas, and that's not true either. Some people have the ability to understand and make sense of, but don't have the original ideas. They get them from elsewhere, and then they develop them, right? Different ideas, the different ways of thinking. The point is, each way of thinking or each way of each intellectual power is equally valuable, but they are different. They're not the same. Let's continue because he explains it even further. To explain this last paragraph here, to explain this independence between Chachma and Bina further, although the point of Chachma, that's like the seminal point of the creative idea, or the Yud, is usually elucidated through the understanding afforded by Bina, at times one cannot find logical reasons, this is so beautiful, that will explain one's germinal idea to others. Okay, 1 second, I'm stopping sharing because I got to share this outside. I want you to get stuck in a wall of text. 1 second. What he's about to give us is a beautiful example. He says, sometimes you know something to be true on the level of Chachma, but you can't articulate it. Your Bina is not working. Your Bina is not, it's not going. Somebody could say, well, explain that to me, and you will not have the ability to explain it, and they might question it. They say, well, it doesn't make sense because X, Y, and Z. What you're telling us doesn't make any sense. And you can't defend it because you can't articulate your defense, but you know it to be true despite the question. This is not an emotional stubbornness. That also could be the case. He's talking about an intellectual truth, a truth that you know beyond the ability to break it down to the other or defend it when broken down by another. Does that make sense what I'm saying right now? So you have such clarity of vision of the idea. I'm mixing obviously the metaphor of vision and knowing. We're going to get to that idea later on in the chapter. That's the Hebrew. The book that we're doing is called, second. The book is called On Ahavas Yisrael, on loving your fellows yourself. It's a book that's out of print. I can share a link to it on Chabad.org. The English is up at some point in the chat. Just remind me before we end the class. So again, this is not a stubbornness, an emotional stubbornness. Like, I don't want to give in. I don't want to be wrong. I don't want to concede that I'm wrong. Therefore, I'm going to ignore the facts and just stick with my position. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about a case where somebody has such a intellectual clarity. You see the idea. It's so obvious and true that even if someone questions it, it's like you're questioning it. It's so obvious. And it might be so obvious you can't even explain it. They're like, well, tell me why it's so obvious. And you're like, how can I explain it? If you don't get it, you don't get it. But it's like, it's so clear to you. What does that mean? What's happening? Break down the process, right? Kabbalistically, what's happening? And at that moment, what's taking place? What's taking place is, what's firing in that person is their chachma. Chachma is seeing the idea. It's that you got it. It's like that clarity. It's that vision. You see it. But your bina. One second. But your bina is not firing. Your bina, which is your ability to articulate it and explain, is not firing. So somebody who's approaching it from a bina place is asking you a bunch of questions. Well, explain this, explain that, explain the other, and you're thinking to yourself, I hear your questions, but I'm seeing this. I mean, I hear your questions, but it's almost like you're asking down here. I'm seeing it up here. I'm seeing it. I see the idea. It's like, I'll give you an example. Imagine you see something, to use the physical, the actual seeing example. Imagine, what's the difference between seeing and hearing? Between re'iyah, seeing, and hearing. Two different senses, but what's the difference? Kabbalah speaks extensively about this. It's actually at the end of this chapter, it gets into it also. Extensive discussion about seeing and hearing, seeing versus hearing. But one difference is that seeing happens in a moment, whereas hearing happens over time. Seeing is all encompassing. Hearing is a linear process. So, give you an example. Let's say you walk into a museum, an art gallery. You walk in and you see a beautiful painting, a masterpiece. You look at it, you're blown away. You fall in love. Everything about it just evokes beauty. You're transformed by the experience. You walk out of the museum, you pull out your cell phone and you call your best friend. You tell them, you'll never believe what I just saw. I was in the art gallery, museum, whatever, and I saw this work by such and such, and it was amazing. They'll say, wow, tell me, describe it. Which was quicker, to see it or to describe it? Which one? To see it. Because when you saw it, you took in the entire image at once. I'm not saying you saw it and then moved on necessarily, but everything, all the information hits you simultaneously. Whereas when you're hearing a description, or more precisely in this case, if you're the one describing it to your friend on the phone after you've left the museum, you're going to have to do it in a linear process. Okay, the size of the canvas was this. Whatever. You're going to break it down step by step to give the person all the details. That's going to take time. And they don't see it at once. They're hearing about it in a process, in a linear. When I say linear, I mean there's like a timeline. First idea, second idea, third idea, fourth idea, fifth idea, sixth idea. You're going to share the story and walk them through that work of art. Seeing is radically different than hearing. In Kabbalah, you guessed it, seeing is connected with Chachma, where you see an idea. The flash of insight comes to you in a moment, and you got it. I got it. Well, at first, you don't even say you got it. I think I got it, but then you got it. But it's still all at once. It's one nakud, it's one general, vision of an idea, of a concept. It's what we call creative minds visionaries, right? Because you can envision it. Bina, the analytical power is now linear. Now it's a slow process. It's methodical. It's breaking it down step by step. It's part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4, breaking it down into parts, into a sequence to make it logical and understandable. So you see an idea. It's clear and obvious and true. You've seen it. And now someone says, I don't understand it. I can't explain it to you. I see it. Maybe I can't explain it. Sometimes it's possible that you see something so magnificent that you're at a loss of words to explain it. I would imagine that each of us in this room, in this classroom, each of us has an experience in our lives that we could not explain to someone else. I'm not saying to no one else, but there are people, let's say a stranger, not only because maybe it's personal or private, but there are things that you and I have experienced or understood or whatever it is that you can't explain to someone else. They would ask questions and you wouldn't be able to explain it, but you know it. You know it. It's true to you, but to someone else, it might not make sense. This is another example of Chachma operating without Bina. You see it. It's so clear and obvious to you and so true to you. But Bina, on a Bina level, you cannot defend it logically. You cannot articulate it to someone else. And so they might ask you questions and you won't even have the answers. But that doesn't change the fact that you know it to be true. Therefore, you're not going to back down from your position. By the way, just to be very clear, he's not saying that all creative ideas cannot be articulated. He's just giving you a case where that might not be the case, or that might be the case where you can't articulate it. And that situation, that scenario, proves his overall point that they're not necessarily connected. You could have one without the other. It's possible. You could have an idea that you see with your mind's eye that you can't defend and explain. Not always, but it's possible. And when that happens, that's a further illustration of the fact that you have Chachma without Bina. Chachma does not necessitate the process of Bina. Chachma doesn't automatically lead to Bina, because then everyone would always be able to defend what they see. You would always have a good answer. And it's not true. Sometimes you just can't explain it, but you know it. Okay, Marianne, I think you had a question or a comment.
Yes, my question is about if it's any relation between the words Chokhmah and Chacham.
Yes. Yeah. When we talk about in Hebrew, Chachma, well, I would say not Hebrew, but Kabbalah. So Kabbalah is very precise with language. Chacham is not just someone who's smart and wise, but Chacham means someone who's creatively intelligent, because Chacham is coming from Chachma. It's the same core word. So in Kabbalah, you would only call someone a Chacham, not if they understand a lot of things, but if they're very creative in their understanding. So for example, and again, it's another quote that we're going to have toward the end of this chapter. The Mishnah says in Pirkei Avot, Eizehu Chacham, who is wise? And one of the answers is Haroeh et Hanolad, one who sees what is yet to occur. So on a very simple level, it means one who's able to see and perceive the effects or the consequences of their actions. That my actions don't just exist in a vacuum, but if I do something, it's going to lead to the creation, to the birth of something else. But in Kabbalah, it's understood on a deeper level. Ezel Chacham, who is a Chacham? Who's wise creatively? Haroa et hanolad, someone who sees what is to be born from the untapped imagination of the universe. In other words, someone who sees that process of birth of new ideas, that's a chacham. Haroa et hanolad, one who sees, again, seeing, right? Not understanding, sees that which is born, not which will be born, but that which is being born, new ideas being birthed in their own mind's eye. That is how we define a chacham. So yes, the answer is a chacham, at least in Kabbalah, is a precise description that refers to someone who is a Baal Chachma, someone who has a lot of the power of Chachma.
Thank you very much. I was thinking all the time that we sometimes describe people in the way like education, if they are intelligent or something like that. It will be so incredible to discover like to be Chacham for learning. A lot of people will be more in if we recognize the creativity like an important place to learn.
Yes, and I think that Kabbalah does not only help us understand what is creativity, but also when you understand Chachma, you understand where it comes from and how it's developed. And like I said before about the notion of bittul, the idea of kind of letting go, creating environments where the rules are not the most important thing, but the discovery is the most important. There's a certain context that you can put children and adults into that stirs the chachma, that awakens the power of chachma. Because again, it's important to know every human being has all 10 powers of the soul, including chachma and bina. When I said a moment ago that it's possible that a person will have an idea and not be able to defend it, doesn't mean they don't have bina. It means in this moment, their chachma, their creativity is so revealed, they're not using right now their bina. It's not leading to the other, but everyone has that power. When it comes to chachma though, I would say there's a wonderful TED Talk by an English academic or educator, I forget his name, who argues that schools in the classic structure of schools serve to actually stifle the creativity of children, of students, because there's so much protocol. Yeah, sorry, Sandy, go ahead.
It's Sir Ken Robinson.
Sir Ken Robinson, and it's like one of the most well-watched. I think it's one of the most popular ever TED Talks. I know I didn't say that sentence correctly grammatically, but it's just fantastic. It's like a breath of fresh air. Somebody who gets it, someone who understands that it's not about the rules; it's about the education. Yeah, you need rules to support the education often, but let's understand what's primary and what's secondary, what the objective is. So if we were to focus, right, if we were designing a school for kids or adults that was about a Chachma academy, right? It was all about Chachma. It wouldn't be, based on come in, sit down at a desk with boundaries and borders and worksheets, and that would not be. You wouldn't box someone in as the context to allow them to get out of the box. That doesn't make any sense. And when I say box, I mean on every different level, physically, spatially, conceptually, behaviorally. Anything that boxes is not what you want to do. What you want to do is advance the notion of, in a sense, a surrender, letting go of labels, letting go of definitions, letting go of the structure so that you can tap into the wonder that is out there. The mind has to be relaxed, not a rigid environment where you're at edge, the teacher, the discipline, the rules, the system, or you don't want to be there to begin with. That has to be removed for creativity to flourish. In a company, right? You want your employees, hopefully, to come up with creative ideas. I mean, hopefully you don't believe, I'm not saying you, anyone you specifically, I'm saying, hopefully, let's say the CEO doesn't believe that they're the only ones that are able to come up with ideas. That's a CEO that's, I don't know, it's a human being, I would say. It's not even a CEO, that's a human being that's misguided because everyone has ideas. And I think the greatest companies we know, especially today, are the ones that tap into the collective wisdom, creative wisdom of the group. In fact, Leah was telling me she read a book a few years ago. She told me a few years ago, so I don't remember exactly which company, but one of the big companies. They had they would have a regular meeting. Maybe it was a weekly meeting. And the way it was in a conference room, and the way it was structured is that they would have, like the heads, they would have, different representation of different segments, leadership, management, and then, more lower workers, so to speak. And the room would be set like the CEO at the head of the table, and then it would fan out from there. And there was a certain power structure built into just the seating arrangement around the table. Well, one day, the conference room was under construction or something happened. They had to go to a different room. And it was last minute, I guess. Maybe it wasn't. Something happened. They couldn't use that room. Last minute, they had to assemble in a different room. And everyone kind of just found a seat randomly. And there was no hierarchy. There was no power structure being imposed in the seating, in the subtle, very, subtle seating arrangement. And what happened at that meeting? Suddenly, everyone's voicing their opinion. And everyone's got creative ideas to share. And suddenly you tear down the rules of who can speak and who cannot speak, even if it's not on the wall. But you create a certain environment, you tear down that environment. And the next thing you know, suddenly you have, Yankel Schmerl, whatever, so-and-so, coming up with a fantastic idea. It's like, where have you been? Where have I been? At the end of the table. Who's going to speak up there? It's not even, you don't even feel permission to speak. So if we were focused, right, to get back to your question, if we were to focus on creating creative spaces for children and adults, we would be thinking about, from a Kabbalistic place, the first step would be how to create an environment where we don't feel the ego, we don't feel the constriction, right? Where we feel expansive, we feel comfortable, we feel free, we feel safe to dream and not be judged, to be creative and not be criticized, right? It's not like, I understand that schools are operating in a certain paradigm, but if I have to raise my hand to speak, to get called on, is that the most creatively conducive environment? Probably not. Now, does that mean that you tear down all the rules for all the schools, for all the kids? No. You have to figure out, but if you're creating a space, let's say within a larger space, right? One period a day, let's say, for creativity. This is our creative, time. You're gonna structure it differently because you understand how the mind needs to work. The mind needs to let go, be safe, to let go and be able to say, I don't know, and I'm okay with not knowing, so let's explore. It has to be open to cracking beyond itself, to seeing, getting a glimpse of higher wisdom that's out there. And it's a wonderful exercise. At the same time, it would be healthy also to advance a Bina Institute, right? How do we develop an analysis? How do we truly and properly take an idea that's already there and apply it, understand it, break it down, make sense of it, defend it? But the point of today's session is these are independent powers. If we combine it all together like a cholent, where everything goes into the same pot and we stir it all up, then we're missing the subtleties. It's not just, a well that turns into a river. It's all the same water. It's not all the same water. It starts off, you have Chachma and you have Bina. And you have to honor each one. You have to honor the process. You have to honor each one. Chachma's honored in one way. Bina's honored in a different way. So the example that he's giving right now, which I want to get back to because it's so beautiful, he's about to cite a Talmudic example of this that will blow you away. It's possible that a person has a Chachma experience. In other words, they have a creative thought, idea, you see it, but you can't explain it. It fails on the level of Bina, but on Chachma, it's obvious. It's possible. And to cite an example, take a look at this one. It's powerful. Take a look at this. Oh wow, time is moving. All right, we're gonna do this quickly and bring in this example, and then we're gonna pause till next week. In fact, not only might the thinker, the chacham, not only will the thinker may not be able to explain it to someone else, the thinker may not even totally understand it himself on the level of bina. You might see it without being able to process it, not only verbally, but even in the mind of bina, it may not be there yet. It may still be on the level of chachma for you. We find such a case, take a look at this. We find such a case in the Talmud concerning the law of a chick hashed on Yom Tov, on the Jewish holiday. Okay, let me stop this for a second. Let me explain what's going on. There's a law on Shabbat and festivals called muktzah. Muktzah means not touching things that were not intended to touch on Shabbat. So for example, something that is forbidden on Shabbat, not only do we not use, but the rabbinic law of muktzah says, don't even touch it. Why? Because from before Shabbat, it was off limits. So once it's off limits, then we don't touch it. Another example might be something that didn't exist before Shabbat or the holiday. Something that doesn't exist, so then if it comes into existence, you didn't have in mind that you were going to touch it or use it because it didn't exist, so now don't use it either. Make sense? Sort of? Ish? Yeah? All right. As long as it's ish, it's also fine because it's a very big topic, but we're just going to treat it very briefly today in this one context. So here's a case of a chick, a baby chicken, hatched on the holiday. So now, did the chick exist before the holiday? No. In other words, as the holiday came in, yeah? What? No, it didn't exist. It was only hatched once the holiday had started. So can you eat it? Can you involve yourself in it? I'm not justifying eating a chick, whatever. I'm just saying, the question is it muktzah or not? According to Rav, this rabbi called Rav, it is forbidden to eat the chick on Yom Tov, on the holiday. When the festival began, the chick was unfit to eat, not having yet hatched. Anything unfit at the beginning of the holiday is thereby rendered muktzah, i.e. handling it is forbidden for the duration of the holiday, of Yom Tov. So it wasn't there when the holiday came in, don't touch it, off limits. That's what Rav says. Rav Kahana and Rav Asi then turned to Rav and asked a question. Rav Kahana and Rav Asi asked Rav, what difference is there between this case of the chick born on the holiday and a calf born on Yom Tov on the holiday from a treifa cow, from a cow that's not going to live too long because it's unhealthy? The law is, now you're learning Talmud. We're going to do this quickly. The law is that a calf born on the holiday is not off limits, it's not muktzah. According to Rav's definition, however, it should be muktzah since at the onset of Yom Tov, the holiday, it could not be eaten. It was unborn and not subject to ritual slaughter. Ordinarily, I'm going to cut this. This is all the brackets. Here's what you need to know. I'm going to make it very simple. Rav cites an opinion about a halachic matter regarding a chick born on the holiday. And two of his colleagues ask a question, and they question his assertion. They question his conclusion. And they say, how do you explain the difference between the case of the chick and the case of the calf? The calf is okay. How is the chick not okay? What's Rav's response? Look at this. Rav was silent. He found himself unable to articulate rationally exactly what distinguished between the two cases. Nevertheless, and this is the point, he did not recant his position because his chachma, his intuitive, unreasoned insight, mandated that the law be thus that a chick hatched on the holiday may not be eaten. He was merely unable to translate this flash of chachma into a rational explanation at the level of bina. So that's it. That's the example. We find the case in the Talmud, and again, I know it's a complicated case, and if we had more time, honestly, we would go through it and break it down, but he's only citing the case to extract this one point, that here you have a rabbi who was very adamant about a certain legal ruling. When questioned by his colleagues, he could not defend his position, and yet he did not back off from his position. And you know what the law is? The Talmud cites a dispute, but you know what Maimonides and others write? The final halacha is like Rav, even though Rav never answered the questions that were applied to his position. He never defended it. The halacha is still like him. The law still goes according to him. You know why? Because he was right. Sometimes you can know something and not be able to explain it. And somebody could say, well, that seems inconsistent, or I have this question, and you can't answer it. Doesn't change the fact. It is what it is. I see it. You saw something unusual. Somebody says, it doesn't make sense. I saw it. It doesn't make sense. Okay. It's fine if it doesn't make sense, but I still saw it. That's how Chachma works. I saw an idea. I got a flash of insight. I love that. I actually love that, the wording in the translation, unreasoned. It's not logical. I saw it. Not everything you see is logical, but I saw it. And so you can ask questions. You might not understand. I might not understand. Still true. So what's the point? We just started chapter 24. It's going to take a few weeks to go through this because it's so brilliant. But what we learned today is one major idea. And that is, although in the normative process of thinking, you first go from Chachma and then go and flow into Bina. You start off with the few drops from the wellspring that then develops into the broad and wide and deep river and long river. Although that's typically the case, you should know that those are two completely different processes. One process is Chachma, creative, and one process is Bina, analytical. They happen in different spaces of energy. They come from different sources. When I say space of energy, they comprise or are comprised of two distinct powers of the soul, Chachma and Bina. They're not the same. Chachma is Chachma, Bina is Bina. They come from different sources above, which we'll talk about next week. We'll talk about in the constellations. We'll talk about in the constellations where they come from. You're going to be blown away by what we mentioned next week. Okay. They exist in a different state of energy below. They come from a different state of energy above. Their source is different. And even in practice, they don't necessarily lead or follow one the other. You could have Chachma that never leads to Bina. You could have Bina that never came from Chachma, right? Let me explain, right? You could have a situation where you got the most creative idea, can't explain it, can't defend it. Rav, he saw the idea, he saw the law, and he's right. Couldn't defend it, couldn't explain it. It's possible. You could see something, you could experience something, you could understand something. You could see something in your mind and not explain it. So beautiful, the words fail. Conversely, you can explain something very well and never have thought of it creatively. You could have Bina without Chachma, you could have Chachma without Bina, all highlighting the fact that they're two distinct energies. Why is this important? First of all, on many levels, understanding how the mind works is, I would say, infinitely valuable on every level, right? For us perceiving others, etc. But it's also because of this beautiful underlying teaching. Because the implication of today's big idea, that although Chachma usually flows in proximity to Bina, they're still distinct. That itself highlights something beautiful. They're different, and yet they work together. They're very different, they're opposite. Chachma is up, Bina is down. Chachma is a nakuda, a point, and Bina is expansion. They are polar opposites, yin and yang. You cannot get more opposite than Chachma and Bina on an energy level, on an intellectual level, and yet, oftentimes, they work hand in hand. Isn't that inspiring? Our minds can work together, Chachma and Bina in harmony. Not always, and the exception proves the rule, right? The exception that they don't work together proves that they're not the same, and yet they still choose oftentimes to work together. And that's a reminder for you and I that we can and must work together with others, even those who think differently than us, who feel differently than us, who look different than us, who act different than us. This book, this work, this text is all about learning how to love. Learning how to love. And it begins by recognizing difference and then learning and recognizing the importance of working together despite difference. Because as different as we are, maybe even contradictory or polar opposites as we are, the bottom line is there's still a commonality that exists, and there's still value, there's immense value in working in proximity to each other, notwithstanding our distinctions. So let's come together. I want to share this. You know, John Lewis passed away yesterday. Yeah, John Lewis? Yes? I want to share with you something that I think is many of you don't know about, that I think is very important to mention. And it's that in 1994, I believe, shortly after the Rebbe's passing, there was a unanimous decision in Congress to award a congressional gold medal to the Lubavitcher Rebbe for his efforts on behalf of everybody, on behalf of the country. Education, you should know this, maybe you don't know this also, or maybe you don't know. National Education Day in the United States, National Education Day USA, is set every year on the Rebbe's Hebrew birthday. Do you know that? National Education Day USA is set annually on the Lubavitcher Rebbe's birthday, Hebrew birthday. Every year it's a different date. The Rebbe was a giant, not only in Judaism and in Torah, but also on a societal level. The Rebbe's advocacy for education is just incredible. And so it was a unanimous decision by Congress to award the gold medal to the Rebbe after his passing. I have a video clip that I want to share with you. A video from that ceremony, and John Lewis is speaking. And I think it speaks to a tribute to the Rebbe, but it also speaks to Mr. Lewis himself and to what he believed in. And ultimately, I think what we all want, which is to bring, this is not about politics, but it's about bringing people together. But I thought, it would be nice to show on this day. So I am going to open this up, and I'm going to share my screen with you, and hopefully it's going to play. Just give me a minute here. And okay, I'm opening it up on my screen, and then I'm going to share my screen with you momentarily. Give me a second. Okay, here we go. It's a 2-minute video, but I'm going to cut it down to be a little bit shorter because I don't think you need the whole piece of it. Break it out. Okay. Now I'm going to share my screen with you. Can you see my screen? Yes, thumbs up?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm going to stop sharing because I realized I didn't share it correctly. Share computer sound and optimize it for video clip. Okay, now I'm going to share it again to make sure that the video comes out okay for you. Okay, here we go. We're buffering. Hopefully we're going to get there. It's so much better when it plays, guys. It's all right.
Is there a link, Rabbi? Can you send
No, I just have video from it. I have like kind of video. I don't, it's not a YouTube or anything like that. It's just a video file that's playing from, attempting to play from Google Drive. But clearly it
Put it onto your local machine first and then play.
It's not a bad idea. It's not a bad idea. So folks, if you want to stop sharing, let me download this. Let's see how long this is going to take. Download it to my computer. Okay. That was a good idea. That was a very good idea, David. Okay, here we go. After much ado, we now have the video. Okay, and we are sharing now. I'm going to show the intro. Some of the audio is not going to be great, but John Lewis at the end is very clear.
The Rabbi took the Torah and brought it down to earth for us.
The house will be in order. The prayer will be offered by the guest chaplain, Rabbi Israel Mayer.
The president will make his own personal presentation of the Congressional Gold Medal in the White House, and I'm proud to say that tonight.
He used to make me feel as if the whole of the world depended on me.
Rabbi Schneerson didn't just believe the ideals, he lived them. And he lived them for a very long time. And there was a continuity and an integrity in his commitment, which itself became a witness to the very ideals, which in and of themselves draw people together in a positive way, and which stand for the kind of decency, the kind of way of life, the kind of spiritual meaning, which allows humans to live with each other in peace and to seek a better and more just future.
Rabbi's eminence as a moral leader in our country was recognized by every president since Richard Nixon for over 2 decades. The Kabbalah movement now has some 2,000 institutions, educational, social, and medical, all across the globe. We recognize the profound role that Rabbi Schneerson had in the expansion of those institutions. We are presenting to you, on his behalf, posthumously, the Congressional Gold Medal. It's one of the highest awards that our nation can bestow on any citizen. As I said, it's a tribute not only to the impact of the work of Rabbi Schneerson around the world, but especially the impact of his work here in the United States, for which we're all profoundly grateful. So, Rabbi, I'd like to present the medal to you now. It's very beautiful, and we're honored to present it to you.
We may no longer see the Rebbe with our eyes, but his spirit lives in our hearts, in our souls, and in our deeds. This award, this medal for the Rebbe, brought Democrats and Republicans, liberals, conservatives, northerners and southerners, blacks, whites, and Hispanics. It brought us all together.
And that's what I wanted to share with you. It's about the clip is about the gold medal that was given to, it was 1995, my apologies, not 1994, about 1 year after the Rebbe's passing. But it's what John Lewis says there at the end is really beautiful, because it really did bring people together. But I love what he said about the Rebbe, how although he's not here in body, his spirit still lives on. And that's true with everybody. The spirit of what people contribute, what they lived for, still can live on in the effect, the inspiration that they have, the effect that they've had on this world, and the inspiration that they've shared with others. So let us commit ourselves as always, but today, because today is today, to do whatever we can to reach out to others and to create connections and not create divides. Because ultimately that is, as we've discussed in this text, that's the greatest, the ultimate battle. The ultimate battle of life is coming together and resisting the urge to split apart. So let's get along and let's make this world a better place. It's great to see you all. I hope you enjoyed. I sent out an email this morning with programming that's coming up. We have a Hebrew numerology course that's starting in August. We have the Jewish course of why starting in August. We have really tremendous things. We haven't yet put it out, but I'm working on a poetry workshop and a jewelry making workshop at home, tied in with Kabbalistic teachings. There's a lot of stuff that's going to happen, and that's being worked on right now. So stay tuned. Join us. If you ever need information about a program or an opportunity, let me know. And I look forward to seeing you soon. Bye, all. We'll see you. Have a wonderful day.
Bye, Ari. Thank you very much.
Bye. Bye,
Bye.
Ari.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thank
Ari.
you
So much.
Safe
Thank
travel.
you very much.
Shavua
Great
tov.
class,
Pleasure.
beautiful.
My pleasure. We'll see you soon. Take care, everybody. Be healthy.